A dog wags its tail when it's happy. A cat wags its tail when it's about to lose its mind. Same body part, same motion, two completely opposite meanings. And somewhere in that one tiny detail is basically the entire explanation for why cats and dogs have a reputation for hating each other that's older than most human languages. Let's get into it. Here's the thing that makes this topic genuinely interesting rather than just, haha, cats and dogs don't like each other. Who knew? Cats and dogs aren't actually wired with some deep, ancient, hard-coded hatred for one another. They're not natural enemies the way, say, a mongoose and a cobra evolved as direct evolutionary rivals. Cats and dogs come from completely different evolutionary lineages, different continents of origin, different social structures, different hunting strategies, and most importantly for this conversation, completely different systems of body language. They essentially walk into every interaction speaking two mutually unintelligible languages while using almost identical body parts to say wildly different things. It's less ancient enemies and more two tourists who don't speak each other's language, both gesturing wildly, and somehow one gesture means hello in one language and an insult in the other. Let's start with that tail thing, because it's honestly the single best entry point into this entire topic. In dogs, a wagging tail generally signals friendliness, excitement, or a desire to engage, though even within dog communication, the speed, height, and stiffness of that wag actually changes the meaning quite a bit. A loose, wide wag means one thing. A stiff, high, fast wag means something much closer to, I am extremely alert and possibly about to do something about it. But broadly speaking, dogs default to associating tail movement with positive social engagement. Cats operate on almost the exact opposite system. A slowly swishing or twitching cat tail typically signals irritation, focus, or mounting frustration. The kind of tail movement that precedes a swat, a hiss, or a full tactical retreat under the nearest piece of furniture. When a cat's tail starts moving with any real intensity, that's generally a warning sign, not an invitation. So picture the scene. A dog, full of enthusiasm, sees a cat. The dog's brain, running on dog language defaults, may interpret almost any tail movement from the cat as some kind of social cue worth approaching. The cat, meanwhile, is standing there with an actively swishing tail, broadcasting in extremely clear cat language, "Back off, I am one more provocation away from violence." The dog doesn't speak that dialect. It reads tail movement, files it under probably friendly, and moves closer. The cat reads this as a direct, aggressive escalation of a warning that was already being ignored. And just like that, you've got a fight that started purely because of a translation error involving a body part both species happen to have. This mismatched body language problem runs much deeper than just tails, and once you start cataloging the differences, it becomes almost comedic how thoroughly these two species manage to talk past each other constantly. Direct eye contact is a great example. In dog communication, prolonged direct staring, particularly from an unfamiliar dog, often reads as a challenge or a threat. Dogs frequently use averted gaze specifically to signal non-aggression and social politeness toward each other. Cats use eye contact very differently. A slow blink from a cat toward a trusted companion is widely considered a sign of comfort and affection, essentially a feline version of a friendly nod. But a hard, unblinking stare from an unfamiliar cat reads as a serious threat in cat language too, just with slightly different thresholds and triggers than the dog version of the same general concept. The overlap sounds like it should make things easier. Both species use staring as a threat signal in some contexts, but the specific triggers, durations, and accompanying body language that turn a stare from neutral to threatening are different enough between the two species that misreads happen constantly, especially in those crucial first few seconds of any new interaction, which, frankly, is exactly when misreads matter most. Let's bring in something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough in this conversation. Fundamentally different default social structures. Dogs descend from wolves that evolved within highly cooperative, hierarchical pack structures built around group living, shared resources, coordinated activity, and constant ongoing social negotiation between pack members. This baked an enormous amount of social cooperative instinct directly into dog behavior. Dogs are, generally speaking, wired to seek out group interaction, establish social bonds, and actively engage with whatever creature happens to be nearby, sometimes whether that creature wants the engagement or not. Cats, meanwhile, descend from largely solitary ancestors. Small wildcats that hunted alone, defended individual territory, and generally didn't evolve within anything resembling the same kind of cooperative pack framework dogs did. This means cats default to a much more independent, territorially protective mindset. An unfamiliar animal suddenly entering a cat's personal space isn't automatically interpreted as a potential friend or pack addition the way it sometimes gets processed in dog psychology. It's far more likely to register first and foremost as a territorial intrusion requiring evaluation, caution, or active defense. So you've got one species biologically primed to approach, engage, and socially investigate, and another species biologically primed to evaluate threats and defend personal space first. Ask questions later, if at all. Put those two default settings in the same room, and conflict isn't some bizarre anomaly, it's almost the expected outcome unless something specifically intervenes to change the dynamic. Now here's where things get genuinely fascinating from a pure instinct standpoint, because there's a deeper, more primal layer underneath all of this social mismatch. Predator-prey overlap. Cats are predators, but they're also, at their size, frequently prey for larger animals, which means cat instincts are wired with an enormous amount of caution and fast-trigger defensive reactivity built directly into their nervous system. Sudden movement, fast approach, loud noise, all of these things can trigger a cat's prey response instincts almost instantly, regardless of whether the approaching animal actually intends harm. Dogs, particularly larger or more energetic breeds, frequently approach new animals with exactly the kind of fast, excited, sudden movement that flips a cat's defensive instincts into high gear almost immediately. From the cat's nervous system's perspective, a bounding, excited dog can register as something uncomfortably close to a fast-approaching predator, triggering exactly the kind of fight-or-flight response evolution built in for genuine predator encounters, regardless of the dog's actual harmless intentions. This creates a genuinely unfortunate feedback loop. The dog approaches with friendly, excited energy. The cat's nervous system reads that approach pattern as threatening regardless of intent and reacts defensively, hissing, swatting, bolting. The dog, especially certain high-prey drive breeds, may interpret a fast-moving, fleeing creature as something worth chasing, an instinct deeply rooted in dogs descending from animals that hunted cooperatively by chasing down fleeing prey. So now you've potentially got a dog whose chase instinct just got triggered by the cat's own defensive flight response, turning what started as a simple social misunderstanding into something that looks, to any outside observer, exactly like a predator-prey chase sequence, even though neither animal necessarily started the interaction with any hostile intent whatsoever. Let's talk about something that genuinely changes this entire equation, because it's honestly one of the most important variables in the whole topic: early socialization. The conflict patterns we've been describing represent default instinctive responses in the absence of positive prior experience, but both cats and dogs are remarkably capable of learning to read and adapt to each other's body language when they're exposed to each other early and positively, particularly during critical developmental windows. Puppies and kittens raised together, or even just raised in households where they're regularly positively exposed to the other species, frequently develop genuinely close bonds, learning each other's specific signals well enough to avoid most of the miscommunication problems we've spent this entire video discussing. This is part of why some households report cats and dogs that are inseparable best friends, while others report constant chaos and conflict. The underlying biological mismatch in default communication systems is the same in both households, but early exposure and learned adapted communication can override a huge amount of that default mismatch. This actually tells us something genuinely important about the whole natural enemies framing this topic usually get stuck with. If early positive exposure can essentially override most of the instinctive miscommunication we've described, that strongly suggests cats and dogs aren't actually hardwired enemies in any deep, unchangeable sense. They're just two species running on different default communication software that, with enough exposure and learning, can absolutely be updated and patched to work together far more smoothly. The conflict isn't destiny, it's a starting condition that can shift dramatically based on experience, which is honestly a much more optimistic and genuinely more accurate way to understand this entire dynamic than the old natural enemies cartoon framing most people grew up with. Let's bring play behavior into this conversation too, because mismatched playstyles represent another genuinely significant source of conflict that doesn't get nearly enough credit. Dog play frequently involves a lot of chasing, body slamming, mouth wrestling, and generally high-energy, high-contact physical interaction, behaviors that are completely normal and even essential within typical dog-to-dog play. Cat play, by contrast, tends to be quieter, more stalking and pouncing focused, involving short, controlled bursts of movement rather than the sustained, high-contact roughhousing dogs frequently default to. A dog attempting to initiate play using its own normal play style, lots of bouncing, body contact, loud, excited barking, can come across to a cat as something far closer to actual aggression or overwhelming, threatening behavior, rather than a genuine, friendly play invitation. The dog isn't being malicious, it's just playing the only way it knows how to play, using a play language the cat never learned to read as anything other than alarming. There's also a genuinely interesting size and power dynamic angle worth bringing up here, because it shapes a lot of how these conflicts actually play out once they start. Even a relatively small dog typically outweighs and outmuscles most cats significantly, which means a cat operating under genuine threat, real or perceived, often defaults to defensive aggression specifically because direct physical confrontation against a larger, stronger animal is usually a losing strategy. Cat aggression in these contexts frequently functions less like genuine confidence and more like a calculated last resort. Fast, sharp, intimidating bursts of claws and noise specifically designed to convince a larger threat that engaging further isn't worth the cost, rather than actually winning a prolonged physical confrontation the cat would likely lose. This is part of why cat versus dog conflicts so often look disproportionately dramatic and intense for their actual duration. A cat's entire conflict strategy is built around making a confrontation look and sound as costly and unpleasant as possible in the shortest amount of time, specifically to end the encounter before it escalates into something the cat genuinely can't win. Let's also talk about territory, because this factor compounds basically everything we've already discussed rather than operating as some separate, independent issue. Cats are notably more territorially sensitive than most dogs, particularly regarding indoor living space, resting spots, and resource locations like food and litter areas. Introducing a dog into a cat's already established territory, especially without a careful, gradual introduction process, essentially stacks an unfamiliar, large, fast-moving creature directly on top of an already heightened territorial defensiveness baseline. The cat isn't just dealing with an unfamiliar animal using confusing body language, it's dealing with that confusing animal showing up directly inside the specific space the cat already considers exclusively its own, adding yet another layer of stress and defensive reactivity on top of everything else already working against smooth communication between the two species. Now here's a detail that genuinely surprises a lot of people once they learn about it. Vocal communication differences play a meaningful role in this dynamic too, beyond just body language. Dog barking, particularly excited or alert barking, tends to be loud, sustained, and can sound to many other animals like genuine alarm or aggression, even when the dog's actual emotional state is closer to excitement or simple communication. Cats, when stressed or threatened, frequently respond to loud, sustained noise with increased defensive reactivity. The kind of loud, sudden vocalization a dog produces even without any aggressive intent whatsoever can independently escalate a cat's stress response simply through volume and unpredictability alone, completely separate from whatever the dog's actual body language might be signaling at the same moment. Let's circle back to something we touched on earlier and dig into it a bit deeper, because the chase instinct specifically deserves its own dedicated explanation given how central it is to so many real-world cat and dog conflicts. Many dog breeds carry deeply ingrained predatory chase instincts, sometimes specifically bred and intensified by humans for hunting purposes across particular breed lines. These instincts can activate almost involuntarily when a dog observes a small, fast-moving creature fleeing, regardless of the dog's actual relationship with or feelings toward that specific animal. This explains a genuinely common, frustrating pattern reported by pet owners, a dog and cat that generally get along fine in calm, low stimulation settings suddenly experiencing conflict the moment the cat makes a sudden, fast movement, even completely unrelated to the dog itself, simply because that fast movement independently triggers the dog's chase instinct on a level that operates somewhat separately from the dog's actual social relationship with that particular cat. It's also worth discussing how stress signals get missed or misread between the species, because this represents one of the more subtle, frequently overlooked contributors to ongoing conflict. Cats display a wide range of relatively subtle stress signals before escalating to obvious aggression: flattened ears, dilated pupils, a lowered, tense body posture, slow blinking, combined with a stiff body. Signals that experienced cat owners learn to recognize quickly, but that most dogs simply have no biological framework for interpreting at all. A dog approaching a clearly stressed cat, showing all of these subtle warning signs, isn't necessarily ignoring them out of disrespect or poor manners, it genuinely may not have any instinctive capacity to read those specific signals as warnings in the first place, since they're not part of dog-to-dog communication at all. The cat escalates to more obvious aggression, hissing, swatting, because the subtle signals clearly aren't working, while the dog experiences that escalation as a sudden, seemingly unprovoked attack. When, from the cat's perspective, it had actually been broadcasting clear warnings the entire time, just using a language the dog never had any chance of understanding. There's also a genuinely interesting evolutionary timeline angle worth bringing in here, because cats and dogs weren't domesticated by humans at the same time, under the same circumstances, or for anything resembling the same purpose, and that difference matters more than people realize. Dogs were domesticated tens of thousands of years earlier than cats, primarily selected and bred specifically for traits related to cooperation, trainability, and close sustained interaction with humans across an enormous range of working roles, hunting partners, guards, herders, companions. Cats, by contrast, were domesticated far more recently and far more loosely, largely self-selecting into human settlements specifically to hunt rodents drawn to stored grain, with far less direct human selection pressure pushing toward traits like cooperative group behavior or close interspecies social bonding. This means dogs spent a much longer evolutionary stretch being actively shaped toward exactly the kind of flexible, socially adaptive behavior that makes learning to read an unfamiliar species' signals more achievable, while cats retained significantly more of their original, independent, less socially flexible wild ancestor behavior simply because there was less evolutionary and selective pressure pushing them away from it. It's also worth bringing up breed and individual variation, because lumping dogs and cats together as two monolithic blocks obscures a genuinely huge amount of relevant nuance. Certain dog breeds, particularly those bred specifically for high prey drive or intense focus on small, fast-moving targets, terriers bred for hunting vermin being a classic example, tend to struggle considerably more with peaceful cat cohabitation compared to breeds selected more heavily for calm temperament or close human companionship over independent hunting drive. Similarly, individual cat personality varies enormously. Some cats display remarkably bold, socially confident temperaments that handle novel animal introductions with far less defensive reactivity than the more cautious, easily stressed temperament you'll find in other individual cats, regardless of breed. This means any given cat and dog pairing represents its own unique combination of breed tendencies, individual personality, and prior experience, layered on top of the baseline biological mismatch we've spent most of this video explaining, which is part of why outcomes vary so dramatically from household to household, even when the underlying species-level explanation stays exactly the same. There's also something worth mentioning about how professional animal behaviorists actually approach introducing cats and dogs successfully, because the methodology itself reveals a lot about which specific factors matter most in practice. Recommended introduction processes typically emphasize gradual, controlled exposure, scent swapping before any visual contact, supervised short interactions rather than immediate free roaming together, and deliberately managing the environment to reduce sudden movement, loud noise, and territorial intensity during those critical early interactions. This approach works specifically because it directly targets the exact mismatch factors we've discussed throughout this entire video, reducing the chances of triggering predator-prey instinct activation, minimizing territorial intrusion stress, and giving both animals enough repeated low-stakes exposure to gradually build an adapted, learned understanding of each other's specific signals rather than relying purely on default instinctive interpretation that, as we've covered extensively, tends to misfire constantly between these two particular species. Finally, it's worth pointing out that this entire dynamic isn't actually unique to cats and dogs specifically. It's just an unusually well-documented and visible example of a much broader pattern that shows up whenever two species with different evolved communication systems get thrown into close, regular contact. Similar mismatched signal interpretation shows up in plenty of other interspecies pairings throughout the animal kingdom. It's just that cats and dogs happen to be the two species most commonly sharing human households worldwide, which means humans have had an enormous front-row seat to observe and document this particular communication mismatch playing out, repeatedly in millions of living rooms across the entire planet for about as long as people have been keeping both animals as companions in the first place. So let's pull this entire picture together. Because once you stack all of these individual factors on top of each other, the full explanation becomes genuinely satisfying in how thoroughly it accounts for basically every common cat and dog conflict scenario people typically report. You've got two species using nearly opposite body language systems for shared physical signals, like tail movement and eye contact. You've got fundamentally different default social structures, one biased toward group engagement, the other toward territorial caution. You've got predator-prey instinct overlap that can turn an innocent approach into something that reads as a genuine threat. You've got mismatched playstyles that can make a friendly invitation look like an attack. You've got significant size and power asymmetry shaping how conflicts actually unfold once triggered. You've got territorial sensitivity stacking additional stress on top of an already confusing interaction. And you've got entirely separate vocal communication systems adding yet another layer of potential misunderstanding on top of everything else already happening simultaneously. None of this requires any actual mutual hatred, any deep evolutionary rivalry, or any of the cartoonish ancient enemies framing this topic has been stuck with for generations. What it actually requires is just two species, each running a perfectly functional, internally, consistent communication and instinct system that evolved completely independently for completely different evolutionary purposes. Suddenly thrown into shared physical space and expected to just figure each other out in real time, with zero shared vocabulary and significant overlapping triggers for completely opposite underlying intentions. And honestly, once you really sit with this, it makes the cat and dog households that do successfully build close bonds even more impressive than they already seemed. Every single one of those genuinely affectionate, cuddled up cat and dog photos represents two completely different communication systems that somehow found a way to bridge an enormous biological gap, usually through nothing more than early exposure, patient repetition, and enough shared positive experience to override instincts that, left completely unchecked, would have pointed these two species toward confusion and conflict almost every single time. It's not that cats and dogs are secretly destined to fight forever, it's that getting along actually requires real, active translation work between two languages that, on paper, really shouldn't be able to understand each other at all. The fact that it works out as often as it actually does might honestly be the more surprising part of this entire story.